Okay, I think we're on the record now, recording. Uh,
Yes,
Hello, everyone. I'm Micah. Welcome back to the channel, or welcome for the first time if you're just joining me. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Jody Azzouni. She's joining me to talk about the rule-following paradox and probably lots of other things as we go along with that. So, Dr. Azzouni, thanks for joining me.
thank you for having me here.
Okay, happy to. Anytime. Um, so first, I guess to say a couple things about you, Dr. Azzouni. You're a professor of philosophy at Tufts University. You're the author of 11 books, numerous articles, defend handful of positions in metaphysics, philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, philosophy of mathematics, including but not limited to nominalism, kind of deflationism about truth, sort of semantic perception view. Some of this we'll talk about. And your two most recent books are on epistemology, attributing and challenging knowledge. I have one of them here. Oh, can't see it because of my camera, but I have challenging knowledge right here that you were
Okay.
kind enough to send a copy of. And you have a new book coming out on introspection and cognitive science. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about towards the end. Um, but yeah, welcome to the channel. And do you want to say anything else about your work, maybe that I've not
Uh,
quite
no,
covered?
no, not offhand. And every now and then I realize there's an awful lot of it. That's kind of my reaction. I'm like, my God. I mean, there used to be a joke about this author who's still alive, novelist Joyce Carol Oates, and there was a cartoon once because I don't know, she's published maybe 50 novels by now, and
Wow.
it was like, "Stop me before I type again." That was a cartoon, and I'm thinking to myself, Jesus, I'm getting that way.
Yeah, this book's the last one, right? You're done after this, is there no more
Yeah,
writing?
right, right. No, no.
Oh, I guess I should say that speaking of novels, that you also write fiction and poetry. So you're
Yeah,
interested
that's
in
true.
language
Yeah.
from multiple angles. Do you tend to enjoy writing one or the other more, philosophy or fiction, or is it?
No, no, I don't actually enjoy writing one more than the other. And this may seem odd, but I kind of write them the same way. That is to say, there's an enormous amount of revision in the process as I'm going along, and I often don't. I often misrepresent to myself where I'm actually going. Usually, I'm thinking I'm going to cover a lot more than I end up covering. And so I end up having to chop things in half. And that happens with everything, all the writing. But so the writing's similar. The processes are similar. Where I do it is similar, in cafes or whatever. So yeah, it's just writing. I like writing.
Sometimes it's to your advantage. I would the recent epistemology books were originally supposed to be one, right? And then now they turned into two. Is that correct?
They turned into three.
Oh, okay.
They
That's
actually turned into three because the third book that's coming out in February, I guess, The Anatomy of Introspection, that was actually also part of the book. It was almost a kind of revisiting of Descartes' second meditation. This is very breezy thing that he does. Oh, let's look at my mind. Oh, yeah, here's what's in it. And therefore here are the tools I can use to do epistemology. And so there was a revisiting, asking, okay, exactly how good as a tool is introspection for epistemology? And the results I was coming up with, of course, in the contemporary setting where cognitive science becomes relevant, et cetera, et cetera. First, everything gets so much bigger. But second of all, it's quite questionable as a tool for epistemology, introspection. And a lot of philosophers would say, oh, no, that's wrong. And a lot of philosophers would say, oh, that's obviously right. But I'm sort of in the middle with a more nuanced position about this. So that's,
often a good place to be. Yeah.
yeah. But
When
I
it,
mean, the point is that was three books.
right.
But this started right at the beginning of my career. The first two books, Metaphysical Myths, which was philosophy of mathematics, and the second book, Knowledge and Reference in Empirical Science, that was supposed to be one book.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So right away it happened. I was going to take care of the mathematics stuff really quickly, and then get to the science stuff, and I realized that's not doable. So yeah.
Oh, there you go. I mean, so some of that will actually, funny enough, connect up with our topic today, both the sort
Yeah.
of talking about introspection and also, misapprehension of what you're doing in the moment. We'll talk about a little bit with sort of these what you've called like projection or error theories with regards to rule following. So
Mhm.
yeah, I guess I should jump into then introducing our topic. So today we're talking about the rule following paradox, especially as it's expressed in Kripke's Wittgenstein on Rules in Private Language.
Right.
We'll introduce it a little bit. I also have a video on the channel just called the Kripkenstein Paradox. It's like a 20-minute introduction. So if anybody wants a quick overview, there's that. And once again, my camera won't pick it up, but we'll be talking a good bit also about the content of your 2017 book. Oh, here, there it is.
No, the
Uh,
camera's picking this up, at least for me.
there we go. Yeah, it's working now. I have to do it at like a certain angle so that the camera blur doesn't get it. I think I was holding it too close last time.
Right now it disappears. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
There
see
we
that.
go. So we're talking about your 2017 book on the rule following paradox.
Is this
Um,
happening because of your background? Is that what's going
I
on?
believe so. There's kind of a
Yeah.
blur effect. Yeah, I have
Good.
it. My room is a mess behind me, so I have instead this nice shot of part of the University of Florida campus, which is
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
much pleasanter to look at, or more pleasant, rather, to look at than.
Actually, my background is the real background part of it. Yeah. So,
Oh, okay, that's good.
so I
Um,
guess I can hold up things and they'll all
oh, there
be
you go. Yeah,
seen,
see,
no matter what angle. Okay, very good.
yeah, yours is much more phenomenologically pleasant to see.
Oh,
You could always make the your background a photo of your exact bookshelf and make it a real life Gettier case. I've heard of philosophers
sure,
doing that before.
absolutely. Except people will pick it up very quickly because I guess the background won't move the right way or it looks artificial in certain respects, you know.
Yeah, sometimes it does that. But yeah, okay, so we're talking about the rule following paradox and its implications for metaphysics is the full title of the book. So I guess we'll say a little bit in a second about what the rule following paradox is, but first I'm kind of curious. You're interested in a lot of issues that are sort of attendant to it, but how did you get interested in the rule following paradox? Like what kind of led you to write this book?
Well, I was planning to write this book since the 90s. Um,
Oh
basically, I
wow, okay.
intended, well, because there's a, I had sort of my view very early about what the implications for metaphysics were, for language, actually. It was more the implications for language um, of the rule following paradox. And that was showing up already in the book Knowledge and Reference in Empirical Science, because I had a picture there of scientific language where there was this kind of split. And the split is we talk a certain way. We have a whole bunch of scientific terms that we use: gold, lead, uh, um, spin, et cetera, all the from the most theoretical to the most ordinary terms. And the view was we talk about them as if the reference is fixed and eternal in some sense. Gold picks out all instances of gold, no matter where they are, and no matter what they're up to, and no matter how inaccessible they are to us. And gold isn't the best example because gold is a relatively inert substance. What's a good example is lead, right? Which is not only exciting because of its sociological implications, what it does to people, but also because it shows up in so many ways. And one of the things you can do is if you take out an article of analytical chemistry or something like that, you'll see where people are still finding, well, we can discover that lead is here, discover that lead is there. Now, my view was already at that point, look, if there's any substance to reference, it's how we get access to these things. There's no magic that the word lead just picks out all in all instances of lead. We don't have powers like that. And so we talk a certain way, but the reality is actually the causal, et cetera, mechanisms by which we get access to lead. And that is something that's shifty. We recognize that certain procedures, that's the word I was using, fail. We didn't realize it before, and that's always changing. And I hope that someone who's sort of familiar with how I'm talking about the rule following paradox sees the echoes, sees the connection there, because it's the same idea. The idea is that We have a certain way that we see our language or see how our language works. And there are various arguments I have that the way we have to see it is indispensable to us. We can't avoid this. And yet, the reality, in a certain sense, on the ground, is a kind of evolving one. I hope that wasn't too murky,
No, I
what I
don't think
said.
so.
Okay.
Yeah,
So the answer was the original version of knowledge and reference in empirical science actually had it was part one, two, three, and four, and the fifth part was on the rule following. And I excised it because it was too big. Too big is, by definition, it's what the press says. The press says that's too big. In this case, Routledge. And then I intended to do it later, and I intended to do it later, and I just never got around to it until I was invited to this Baltic conference, and then I gave. And they told me, oh, it's an article, but it can be as big as you want, and that's what I wrote. And then I doubled it in size later and got the book. So that's the history. But I've been living with the idea. It's almost as if my particular solution to it, and this might be dangerous, preceded my actual analysis of the
interesting.
Kripkean approach. Although of course, I had read it and I'd been influenced by it, etc. It wasn't as if, I had a view and then I went and read the book. That's not what happened.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess it's kind of curious because it sounds like the way you kind of almost got into it is via something like an analysis or thinking about kind terms. And
Yes,
the paradox doesn't at least start that way. It's taken to have that like implication, but it starts with this arithmetical example. So it's interesting that you came to it from thinking about natural kinds first and then sort of thinking about maybe the arithmetical stuff after the fact. Is that kind of the case?
that's kind of the case. What was happening is, um, in each case, I was thinking about what were the resources we have to kind of fix what our words, our practice refer to. And so you realize it's the same kind of maneuver. You're thinking about the kind terms and what are our resources for fixing what those refer to. And then in the case of counting or other arithmetical operations, it's what are our resources for grasping, and here grasping the full extension, grasping the scope of the term. And so the same, in a broad way, the same issue comes up, which I can put in a quasi-religious way. We are finite, frail, mistaken beings, yet the referential relation is perfect. And I'm sorry, there's a mismatch there. And now the question is, what does that mean, and what can you do about it, or what should you do about it? And here I'm Wittgensteinian in a certain sense. I'm saying, no, you don't do anything about it. You understand it, but you don't do anything about it. I'm not telling you to revise how you talk, and I'm not telling you how to revise how you do arithmetic and science either. So yeah,
Cool.
yeah,
Okay, yeah, I like this. But so the idea is maybe partially at least less so to look at, something like reference as sort of crystallized notion outside of human practice. The idea is more like, okay, what are people actually capable of doing in these kinds of cases, and how does that maybe influence some of the theoretical stuff we're talking about? Is that something
that's
like the
right.
idea? Okay.
Right. But also, it's important to realize, why do we talk about reference the way we do, and should we keep doing so? And the answer is yes. I want to say also, because, and that has to do with the way I couched it in knowledge and reference and empirical science was, if you didn't, you were going to fragment your language in a way that was going to be horrible. So, for example, every time you changed how you were finding out something new about lead, you were going to introduce a new word. And it was like, well, no, that's hell. That's language hell. We can't do that. And that was the idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I like it. I'm amenable to this kind of approach, I think. So should we say, I don't know if we should say too, I mean, you kind of answered it. I had this question on our sort of outline of, why is the rule following paradox important, like philosophically? And maybe you've just
Yeah.
answered it there um, already a little bit, at least to you. But I mean, maybe one way to put the question is like, what kind of issues does talking about the rule following paradox touch and like bring in? Like, why has this been such a issue of perennial philosophical interest, do you think?
Well, I mean, in my view, for good and for bad reasons. The good reasons are it really does, thinking about it, really does very quickly get us to the question of what kind of resources do we have for uh, for the things we do. Our just stick to arithmetic for the moment. For arithmetic, what kind of resources? How do we talk about it? And it connects to the metaphysics. What kind of picture must we have about um, what arithmetic is? What kind terms pick out, what they actually pick out, and things like that. So it touches on metaphysics. It doesn't touch, it's deeply embroiled in it. It touches on what kind of beings we are. And then there's other things too. Something that's much more visible with Wittgenstein than it is with Kripke, right? When I talk about our resources, I'm talking in a way that's much more in accord with how Kripke thinks about it. That's why so much time is spent by Kripke on the dispositional approach. But the other thing that's important is our image, our psychological self-image of what we're doing when we engage in rules and when we think about ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what Wittgenstein is very, very much concerned with. And yes, I've and it touches on that as well because well, it's obvious that it does. And a third thing that comes into play that I think is much less important, but has been very big in the recent literature, is the focus on um, how should I put it, the normative elements that seem to be at work. Okay. This comes up in the idea that, for example, that what makes a language is that the terms of it have correctness conditions. Okay, and the correctness conditions, and then the question is how are we supposed to analyze correctness conditions? So the other thing that's coming up, I guess I didn't make that loud and clear, is what is a language? And what are we doing when we are successfully communicating to one another, as we think we are, at least most of the time, not in political settings, obviously, uh, right? And and what kind of thing is a language? So again, it comes back to metaphysics. So the rule following paradox um, unearths all of this. So it's really quite central,
Yeah,
you know.
I agree. I mentioned to you this is one of the things I'm most like interested in reading and thinking about, which is part of why I chose to talk about it. I also chose to talk about it because I felt like it was almost poetically required that I did so because I found out about you and your work through this book because I was looking around for resources on the rule following paradox online and someone recommended this book. So that's how I found out about your work, which then led to uh, me suggesting we invite you to Florida for the graduate conference. So I
Oh,
figured this
right.
is kind of this is the topic is how we met. So it was almost poetically required that I talked to you about this
Okay,
one.
that's interesting that you say that because when I met you at the conference, that wasn't the book of mine that you showed me.
Yeah, at the time I'd only had a
Showed me a
copy of
different book.
yeah, the Talking About Nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the only one I had a copy of at that point.
Oh, okay.
Because I also am interested it turns out I'm also interested in plenty of the other issues that you touch on and talk about there. So the kind of uh deflationism and fictional reference and that kind of thing I'm also
Right.
interested in. I mean, so one thing you said there that I think is maybe I don't have quite the same sense of the literature, but from what I have read, people are less explicit about the metaphysical uh, like metaphysical implications of the rule following paradox and such. Like you have this focus in the book on, what the implications might be for correspondence metaphysics. Um, which is interesting, and I've not seen as many people talk about it. Like the papers I've read on it that've come out more recently, like one by Warren in 2020, we might talk about. It's still just focused on the kind of all the dispositional stuff, the purely like semantic conditions. So I think connecting this up to the metaphysical issues is cool and not something I've seen done as
Well,
much.
well, what happened was the literature kind of split in a way. So the literature you're talking about, which is officially about rule following, is focused just as you describe it. It's focused on the dispositional approach and can it be fixed, or can is it really in trouble? And it's also focused on the normativity question. In what
Yeah.
sense are norms coming into play? What kind of norms, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole bunch of people doing that. And if you look up Stanford Encyclopedia articles on it, that's what they focus on. But what also happened was there was this other literature that got created around the same time because of David Lewis's response to both Kripke and Putnam. So this is all happening in the early 80s, okay? 82, 83, 84, 85, something like that. And what happened was that's when Lewis offered his reference magnetism approach, which he did not call reference
Right.
magnetism.
Yeah.
So it's important to realize, that term came later. But nevertheless, the approach he was making, so he was making claims about two kinds of claims. One claim was about what the metaphysics had to be. So there had to be something like elite classes, or there had to be properties that were singled out in a special way. But in addition, he was also making a claim about how language had to hook onto that. Okay. And that was picked up by a later generation of metaphysicians, okay, who were only obliquely interested in the rule following problem. What they were interested in was working out the metaphysics in some way, in detail. So that was the literature I was dealing with in the book. Um, and I wasn't dealing so much with the other literature except glancingly. Now I'm dealing with it a little more in a paper that's forthcoming. But that's why you see this kind of thing that happens. And this has been a general pattern in philosophy since the 80s anyway, but this is just another interesting illustration of it, where these bubbles form. Basically, I don't know what to call them, philosophical bubbles, I might as well call them.
It
So you've
works.
got a
Yeah.
bunch of people all talking about this and a bunch of people all talking about that. And it ties back to often things in the 80s. So there are these figures who are being talked about by everybody, but then the branches occur and there's not much crosstalk there. This is a problem I have. I tend to be a crosstalker. So, so I'm talking about the metaphysical people, but I'm also talking about the other people, and they're not talking about each other very much.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, someone has to be. I mean, clearly they're not only related, like they are sort of interrelated, interlinked.
Yep,
So it's like all the reference magnetism stuff is metaphysical, but it definitely depends on like a view of how language and reference work. So yeah, I you can't really look at it separately from that, I don't think.
that's
Um,
right.
okay.
Although then you'll notice shared assumptions that are being playing a role in both literatures. So for example, all of the people in the metaphysics literature, Lewis, and then later people, Sider, Hawthorne, etc., they're all relying on a picture of semantics that's truth-conditional semantics. And then when you look at the other side, and you look at Boghossian and the other people go on, and they're also assuming truth conditional semantics, but there, and both groups, by the way, at least at certain stages, are assuming that's the only game in town. There is
Right.
no other semantics other than truth conditional semantics, and and that argument is playing a role, but otherwise it's parallel worlds.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, you see this thing happen a lot too, like debates in philosophy of mind that depend on a kind of like two-dimensionalism. So there's always like a sort of dependence on a a semantics in the background with like the, Chalmers, Stalnaker stuff. So yeah, I mean, yeah, cross-talking is good, I think. I think it's worth making all of these things clear. Just part of why, one of the reasons why your stuff is fun to read, I think. Um, okay, cool. Well, thanks for help with the background there. I think I don't want to bog us down too much in explaining what the rule. I think if people are watching this, they should hopefully kind of have some background. But if you don't watch my video, I think in basic terms, the rule following paradox or the rule following problem, or what's sometimes called the Kripkenstein problem, it comes from Kripke's interpretation of an argument in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. But the very basic form of the argument, as I'd put it, is um, we need to, in order for us to mean anything by a word, there needs to be some fact of the matter that we always meant to apply that word in the same way all the time. And Kripke dramatizes this by this bizarre skeptic who, when you add two words together you've never added together before, comes up and says, well, in virtue of what are you adding uh, those two words? Like, what if all of your past uses were actually this deviant function that gave you all the same results as addition, but in this case, you should answer something completely aberrant, like five, as opposed to what the arithmetical function would be. So, right, when you give an answer to an addition problem, Kripke says there's a sense in which it's correct, it's arithmetically correct, but there's this further sense in which it's correct, it's metalinguistically. And that is just to say that in carrying out the function, you do what you always meant to do in carrying out that function in past cases. And this is what the bizarre skeptic challenges. They challenge the metalinguistic fact that they say, well, maybe uh, you actually meant a deviant function this whole time. So the idea is to look for a fact in virtue of which you mean to apply the plus function the same way you always did.
Right.
And the point then generalizes to like meaning anything by a word. If there's no fact of the matter that determines that you meant plus and not quus in the present case, well then there's nothing that determines you're meaning anything by any word. And so it's a kind of an undermining of
That's right. And
semantic
the
realism.
and
Yeah.
the trick all the time is you're allowed to offer up any resources, and resources would be um, previous exercises of counting, but those are finitary, so they don't handle new cases. Or you've got a rule of some sort, and in an arithmetical case, it can be a rule or an algorithm. But the problem is that, and this is very clearly in Wittgenstein. Well, so is the finitary stuff. Well, that can be interpreted in a different way. The way you're describing it, to interpretation, which is not built into what the actual statement of the rule. So that turns out to be the issue. And then finally, the way dispositions come into play is you get desperate enough. You say, well, never mind what's going on in me consciously. What about unconsciously? What about what I was just going to do? And then the claim is, but wait a minute, that kind of misses the point, because what you were doing when you were confidently going on with your rule, with your, acts of counting or acts of adding, was you were confident and you were sure that this is what you were doing. You were justified. And how is something that's unconscious even relevant to
Right.
that sensation? So that, one of the interesting things about the rule following paradox is that, and this is very clear in the Kripke, it's very accessible, So you don't have to, you can just read it, and it's self-contained. I mean, it's very striking to me that Kripke describes his book as an elementary exposition,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and in a certain sense, it absolutely is. So it's very accessible that way. I don't know. I'm sorry. I am.
No, no, that's helpful. Yeah, so, I mean, hopefully I characterized it broadly speaking somewhat
Yeah, no, it's
well, and
fine.
then okay, great. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about. I think it'd be fun as we mentioned a lot of the connections about language. So I wanted to kind of start off by before we jump into talking about the paradox itself, asking some questions about how you kind of think about language in your work, and maybe how your thoughts on that are developing, and see how that applies to the rule following stuff. But before we jump into that, let me give you my like quick précis of what I think the sort of point of your book is, and you can tell me if I.
Yeah, now pause just for a moment. I don't know, because I realize I have background music on, and I have no idea if that's coming into
Oh,
this. I was
It's
about to
not,
shut.
I'm not hearing anything, so I think we're
All
okay.
right, well, they just got operatic, and I'm like, I want to turn that off because that's distracting. So give me 2 seconds.
All right, we're back. So yeah, I mean the as far as the rule following dialectic goes, there are a handful of moves made, and your book is kind of pointing out this option that's been unrecognized before. So basically, we'll get into some of this in a little bit when we talk about the desiderata on a solution to the rule following paradox.
Mm,
But um, essentially, I see the point of your book as being, look, uh, so far, the dialectic has gone this way. You have these like grounding facts. So whether there's a question of whether or not there are facts about the individual, like psychologically or dispositionally, that make it the case that they mean something by a word. And straight solutions to the paradox are trying to say, yes, here's the fact of the matter in virtue of which
that's
they
right.
meant this or this. And Kripke argues against all of those, and Kripke offers a skeptical solution, one that says there are no grounding facts, but because there are no grounding facts, you have to replace talk of truth conditions with talk of assertability conditions. And so you get a kind of skeptical solution where you can talk about assertion conditions, but not truth conditions. And your book is kind of, again, nuanced position as far as I understand it. The position you defend is a skeptical solution in that you agree with Kripke there are no grounding facts in virtue of which the person means plus or quas. But it doesn't follow from there being no grounding facts that you have to replace truth conditions with assertability ones. So
Exactly.
yeah, so there are no grounding facts. It's a skeptical solution, but it's a truth conditional apt skeptical solution. Is that the idea?
Yes, it's
Okay.
a. That's right. That um, everyone is assuming, and they're assuming this along a whole bunch of dimensions, that truth conditional semantics requires, in a certain sense, correspondence.
Right.
And the thing I've been always stressing, and you know, this involves something that uh, for many years I described my approach to truth as deflationary, and I should not have, um, uh, because most deflationists, if not all deflationists, tended to feel, okay, so there's no correspondence at all. Okay. And the word just has a very, very simple use, a redundancy use or a blind description use or something like that. But it's you cannot express correspondence with it. And my view is actually a neutral. It's a neutralist view about true, so that we talk about things that are true. And let's assume for the moment that uh, books exist. I think a lot of people will be on the same page with that, and tables exist. So I think a sentence like "the book is on the table" is true, is can be understood in a straightforward correspondence way. That's not a problem. However, there are other sentences that are true, like Mickey Mouse was invented by Walt Disney, and that cannot be understood in a correspondence way. And then there's a lot of literature. Well, it can't, but it can be transliterated, or there's a or we can put a pretense operator in front of it, or we can play some sort of game. And I'm saying, no, you don't have to do any of that. Truth is perfectly okay as it is. In fact, if you really want to be formal and go Tarski truth is perfectly okay with something like that. So that's what's in the background of the view that, in point of fact, when you come to the rule following issue, even if there are no grounding facts or no full grounding facts, you still can have truth conditions. And what I do towards the end of the book, when I get to right Crusoe 5, who's supposed to be, so you've got successive individuals on an island who have language practices. That's the idea, because in the book I was focused on, we don't have to go for the Kripkean solution that you need a community. You can have language practices. An individual can have their own language practices without anybody else being around. Okay, and it can be cogent. And this was something neither Wittgenstein, well, Wittgenstein didn't buy it, and whether Kripke did or not, we don't know. Um, there's um, there's a lot of unpublished stuff
Yeah.
that Kripke wrote, and so what Kripke actually thinks about all this is perhaps lurking in some manuscript somewhere uh, that we haven't hasn't seen the light of day. Anyway, my picture is that regardless, you know, an individual can have. This is all in principle. I'm not talking about what's psychologically, neurophysiologically possible for humans. Can have um, truth conditional language, literally, and use the notion of truth successfully. And that can be done along the same lines as we actually do in ordinary life when we um, talk about a whole bunch of things um, and say true things about them, even though they don't exist and don't have any properties.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I
Is that
like
all
this.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll talk. Yeah, I have questions about some of that, which we'll get to maybe when we talk about the Crusoes a little bit more. But I guess one question, something you just said was interesting. Well, I should say one of my favorite examples I've heard you give before is a sentence like, there are just as many Greek gods as goddesses, right? Like that's a
Right.
sentence that's, if it's true, it's not true because of any sort of correspondence relation, but it would be really strange in natural language to say that like something like that is false if it turns out to be true, given the sort of like mythological practices. Um, as far as contrasting your view with other philosophers, I'm currently reading, one of the things I'm currently reading is Kripke's Reference in Existence, which I know you have a review of. I've not gotten to read yet, but so what do you think of his view? Like he has this view about abstracta, like something like Mickey Mouse or like Sherlock Holmes, where sentences about them are made true because they do exist. Uh, and they don't exist in like some Meinongian sense. They're just abstracta. They exist in like the same sense that like numbers do. Um, which of course you don't buy that numbers exist either, and neither do I. But that's kind of Kripke's way of making sense of, and you might think that's a way of trying to salvage a kind of correspondence notion of
Well, there
truth
are
about fictional
always,
discourse. Yeah.
yeah, there are always ways to try to salvage the correspondence picture. And I think even Meinongianism is motivated that way because I think what's going on is that, and so I'm going to come back to the Kripke in a second, but this line I've been running for a while, which is there's a kind of cognitive illusion we all suffer from. Okay, so you say something like, "We agree Hercules doesn't exist in any sense at all, and we agree that Pegasus doesn't exist in any sense at all." And but we cannot escape the impression that I've just talked about two different beings and
Right.
said that neither of them existed. Now, strictly speaking, that doesn't make any sense at all. And this is already in Plato, okay,
Yeah.
this puzzle. And I think it's just the way we process psychologically um, imaginary things and real things, which is we invariably have this aboutness illusion. And I think that's what's behind, I feel, these kinds of things. So, so yes, a big practice is in what you might call the philosophy of fiction, fictions, is to find some sort of substitute that you can that the terms can refer to. So Kripke was picking up abstracta, and then you have to tell a little bit of a story about why we say things about Mickey Mouse that don't quite correspond to what you would say about abstracta. Okay, and other people have done this similar things, often influenced by Kripke's lectures, because those lectures circulated sort of in an underground way
Yeah.
for decades before they actually got published. But and then you have people who try to think about, that fictional objects are a kind of social object or something like that. And then you also have people like who want to deflate the notion of existence altogether and say something to the effect of, look, um, you, Jody, are, relying on some not fully articulated picture of things exist and some other things don't. But really, it's all Existence is a very soft idea and applies to these things as much as anything else. And so there's really no issue. So, as you can see, there's like very different ways of handling this. And I can't get past the idea that, look, you got to think about what happened to you as a small child when one or another being that you had been emotionally attached to, Santa Claus or some other being in some other cultural tradition, or in my case, hobbits or whatever. And then the cold, hard fact that these things don't exist. And that's put plainly to you. Your imaginary friend doesn't exist. And I think that's the root notion that we all have. And uh, the only point that I'm making, in a certain sense, if once I have that, the philosophical point, not the philosophical point, I want to call it a linguistic point. The linguistic point that I want to go on to make is that, look, our language is already designed to handle this. We can talk about non-existent beings and say things that are true or false about them without having to attribute properties to them. I mean, there's a sense in which we attribute properties to them. I say Mickey Mouse has black ears, but that's a sentence, which is true. And what's going on with the black ears is there's nothing there. There's no Mickey Mouse, and he doesn't have black ears, et cetera, et cetera. But we can talk this way, and it's consistent, and there's nothing strange going on linguistically. And then when we create formal analogs of natural language, the first one, the most well-known one being, um, uh, first order predicate calculus with Tarski and semantics, then the claim is we can do the same thing there. There's nothing technically involved in that requires us to interpret a sentence like Mickey Mouse has black ears or Mickey Mouse doesn't exist um, as existing in any way whatsoever. So that's basically what the move is. And so when we come to the rule following situation, it's the same thing. The fact that there are no grounding facts doesn't stop us from talking a certain way. And that's what enables us to be able to talk about arithmetic the way we do and talk about, in the case of the book I'm speaking of specifically, lead, coconuts, whatever, kind terms, as if they pick out everything, I don't know how to put it, that they refer to, even though there's nothing underneath that in many cases, is not a problem for the language.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, clearly it's not we get along with language just fine.
Well, that's
Um,
the idea, but a
yeah.
lot of people are going to say we get a lot. Azzouni, harshly put, we get along with language just fine because you are not describing what's going on in language correctly. So it's at this point that I start invoking friends like John Collins, who knows his linguistics really well, and says, no, 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 Azzouni is right about this. There's there are no ontological commitments built into the semantics of natural language. So that's where that debate ends up.
Okay, I like it. Yeah, as Wittgenstein says at one point, the back to rough ground.
Yeah,
We reify things too much. We can't get grip anywhere. So it's fine. The language is fine
right.
as it is to some degree.
But the other thing that he's saying is he's saying we reify things too much, right? And he also says how we talk is okay,
Yeah.
and that in these respects, I'm extremely Wittgensteinian, despite all the technicalities that I constantly pull into everything that I.
Yeah, well, this leads pretty well into my next question, actually, just in terms of talking about how you think about language. So, one of your colleagues at Tufts, Avner Baz, is a ordinary language philosopher, and
Yeah.
you once, I think, if I remember correctly, told me at dinner that Austin is either your favorite philosopher or one of your favorite philosophers. I've also heard you remark in another podcast, though, that you're not an ordinary language philosopher, and that seems clear to me as well. But how do you, in essence, see the relationship between, say, philosophy and ordinary language? Like, in what sense are you not an ordinary language philosopher? Um, in what sense you may be like, because you clearly use like natural language and like kind of ordinary language locutions to make certain points in your work. So how do you see the relation between philosophical problems and like ordinary language analysis?
Well, I'm going to sort of answer your question by talking about something else entirely.
Okay, that's fine.
And then we'll come back to it. And it's your
Okay.
job, of course, to make sure that I haven't evaded the question like politicians so often do.
Right.
I'm seeing them now as a model of how not to talk to anyone about anything ever. But leave that aside. So I'm going to start with the following. One of the concerns I've had for a very long time, and it started, and this is the work I do in philosophy of mathematics, was very interested in the following question: what's the relation between formal tools and mathematics, ordinary mathematics? Because ordinary mathematics, before Frege, occurred in ordinary language. And then Frege showed up, and Frege really was intending to change the practice in a profound way, I believe. He wanted people to start using the formal language to do mathematics. And that has not happened. Today, as much as we ever did, we use ordinary language when we do mathematics. We use ordinary language when we do science. Now, it's not just ordinary language, it's ordinary language with all sorts of gadgets and devices and tools and so on. And those tools are informed by logic and mathematics, etc. So the real question that I've been grappling with is exactly how does this amalgam work? This blend of natural language and formal apparatus, and you can see it happening right at the beginning of mathematics, right with the ancient Greeks, with the and most of the modifications are taking place in the lexicon. So the lexicon is being augmented in an interesting way. And then the question is what's going on and what are the properties? So at the one of the things that's going on is, although like an ordinary language philosopher, I'm saying everything is actually still taking place in ordinary language, including our science. Right. This is something, by the way, that at least Chomsky never dwelt on this, but at one point he certainly makes it sound like that's not what's going on. That what might be going on is that when you're doing something like physics, you're actually in an artificial language. But it seems to me clear you're not. You're still in ordinary language with new tools, with new language tools. And I think that started happening as we developed arithmetic and things like that. So I'm that's where I'm located. So in a certain sense, I can't be an ordinary language philosopher because I'm not. I'm thinking ordinary language is this thing that's being modified as we speak. And it's being modified in a very strange way because I'm convinced that natural language is kind of species specific, innate, blah, blah, blah. And yet we can then go on to modify it. And it's not that the children who grow up learning the modified language. That's not what happens. They grow up learning a natural language, but they also know how to incorporate all this other stuff. And so I'm always thinking about, how's that being done? And how are we getting these things to work together? And how are we getting the semantics to work, et cetera? So that's the kind of thing I'm doing. And that's why I can't really be described as an ordinary language philosopher. But
Interesting. Yeah.
but what I really like, how does it kick in with philosophy? Well, it kicks in with philosophy. See, I was going to answer your question. I really was. I really was. The way it kicks in with philosophy is for better or for worse, except in very rare circumstances. Philosophical arguments, philosophical debate is all taking place still in natural language. Now, it doesn't
Yeah.
always look that way, and there's always modifications. So if you just look at epistemology, you realize what's going on is people are coining new expressions or um, modifying terms, et cetera, and sometimes they can get away with it, and sometimes they can't. But most people, for example, are really focusing on here we have these ordinary words that we use that are very crucial, like know and like believe. And now the question is twofold: how are they actually being used? What properties do they have? And second, can we modify them in a way, or ditch them and get another set of terms that are better, maybe ones from probability or something like that. So I see that as the situation. But what's really crucial is to be clear about about the data that bears on terms like no. So now what comes in, especially in epistemology, and there's a lot of debate about this, are things like the thought experiments,
Yeah.
starting with the Gettier kinds of things. And then there are people who are saying, look, you're relying on your intuitions. I don't know what the word intuition really means here. What I know we're relying on is our grasp of usage. And now you can understand why I have such high respect for someone like Austin, because what's striking to me about Austin is how good his ears are. He's listening. What do we say? What don't we say? And it comes up with terms like, which are seriously dealt with in the literature, terms like evidence. So, how do we use the word evidence? When do we use the word evidence? And so often a philosopher runs an argument, in my view, of a certain sort. Here's how we want to modify the word evidence, or here's how the word evidence is being used. And I'm like, you're not listening. You're not listening to how people use the word evidence. And you're not paying enough attention to the question of why do they use it this way? Is this a mistake? Can we change it? Should we change it? And if we do change it, is it going to bump up against other words in a weird way, like words like justification? So and this is something Austin noted in passing, but it's really important. Words, when we're modifying words, and mathematicians get a free pass here that philosophers don't, because what a mathematician is often doing is they're in they're pretty much they look like they're using ordinary words, but when it comes to the lexicon, they're really just coining. And so they may have to make sure their words fit well with other words that they're also inventing. But that's not happening in epistemology, because what's happening there is you've got a whole body of words working together: belief, know, justify, evidence, etc. And these words are connected to each other in strange ways. And philosophers often think, oh, the way they're connected to each other is by necessary and sufficient conditions of some sort. That's why we were so entrenched by the Gettier issue for so long. But still, people are looking, and words don't always connect quite that way. Um, um, and it's much more subtle, and the subtleties are important. So, I mean, this is where I look the most like an ordinary language philosopher. But again, I'm always thinking about conceptual engineering. I'm always thinking about, can we modify it? And then occasionally I find cases where I see that a word could be modified. It doesn't seem to matter, and it's important to try to figure out why, because other cases are rigid. So, for example, I'm very struck by the word remember as it's used in natural language, because it seems to me there's both a factive and a non-factive use. There's a I really remember putting my wallet in that drawer, but it's not there, so I obviously didn't do it. As opposed to someone saying, I remember P means P, which is how
Yeah.
Moore, for example, saw it. But it seems to me clear the word can shift either way. And then you want to look at why. So then when you look at a word like no, once you get clear about how that word is actually working, you want to ask yourself, well, can it change? Can it evolve or not? So I don't know if but that's That's the
Okay.
picture of what I'm engaged in, and that's the why I think I can't say I'm an ordinary language philosopher. I'm too aware of the fact of the technical tools that are being used to modify language.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. I mean, yeah, because I mean, but it also seems like part of your view is that the technical words or the technical terms, whatever's going on in the technical sphere is often in some sense still taking place within a natural language domain. So you have to kind of be sensitive to ordinary usage. Yeah, I mean, I think it's in Sense and Sensibilia. Austin says something like this, where he's like, we have to look at the ordinary usage, but that doesn't mean we have to leave it exactly how it is. We might want to clean it up a little. Um,
Exactly.
and that,
But then
yeah.
you want to be careful because you want to see what else is in the field, in the terrain. And actually, in the new book, one of the things I look at is Austin doesn't necessarily take his own advice. So I look at that mid 20th century, the bunch of ordinary language and people that are being influenced by it, um, Austin and Ayer and Anscombe, and look at their concerns with the word see.
Yeah.
And over and over again, I realize they're a little too focused on the single word. They're not paying enough attention to the other words in the environment, observe and perceive, and asking themselves, how are these the same and how are these different? Again, there's this is the sort of thing that you might say, well, there are people who love the details about how insects differ from each other. Are you doing that a little too much of that? And the answer is no. I'm not quite, because there are philosophical issues that are emerging here. One of the things that's striking to me, for example, with these words is philosophers have had a tendency to see ontology as being involved in ordinary language with the word see, and in particular. And again, the lesson is the one thing that ordinary language doesn't seem to care about very much is ontology,
Yeah,
um,
for
in so
sure. Yeah.
many ways. Yeah. So that, I mean, that's just more of the look. When we're talking about Mickey Mouse and we're talking about Walt Disney, we can do it all in one breath, and there's really no problem here with truth or with the semantics or with anything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, interesting because yeah, I mentioned Kripke's reference in existence, right? But that kind of comes up there where he in a little bit naming a necessity, but more in that one where he's wanting to sort of draw these conclusions based on ordinary usage, and he'll draw a conclusion about maybe like a truth aptness of a sentence from ordinary usage, and then he'll say, well, I mean, it follows from this then like we treat existence the same way, so it follows like the existence of Sherlock Holmes as an abstracta in some sense follows from the natural language
Right.
usage, but that of course doesn't follow because the natural language
That
usage
doesn't
isn't
follow. That's right.
making an
Yeah.
ontological commitment. Um, so yeah, I've seen that pop up in other work too. So that's interesting. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for that. Sorry to ask you so many questions about language to frame
No, no,
this,
no,
but
no.
they're
I mean, I'm continuing to do a lot of work in language, sort of off the beaten path uh, work, but nevertheless.
great.
So,
Okay, so I think yeah, we're probably about a halfway or more mark now. We're approaching an hour. So let me know how timing looks for you. But I guess we should turn to talking a little bit about the content of the book, uh,
sure,
the rule following paradox stuff, and maybe some updated thoughts you have on it. So I kind of gave my précis of what I thought you were up to ultimately with the book, and I think it's also worth pointing out that the book has it has a couple like critical elements, and also so you're kind of building this view about a possible um, different skeptical solution than Kripke's that's available in logical space. But there's also a critical element of the book where you sort of bolster Kripke's criticism of dispositionalism, and then you take on a bit of this reference magnetism stuff and
right.
argue against that. So maybe we can talk about the critical stuff a little bit first, then maybe we can talk about the Crusoe cases a bit after that.
Mhm.
Um, so it's worth starting off which we won't go through everything. I mean, we wanted to leave a little bit for people to go read for themselves. So some of the Crusoe cases, some of the details we'll leave to the imagination, as it were. But so I think it's worth starting with so like the desiderata. So like, what would it take to have a solution to the rule following paradox? And I mentioned this distinction you draw between grounding and correspondence facts. So as I remember, I think the way you put it is that, there are grounding facts, which are facts about, or psychological facts about the individual. or possibly.
Psychological, neurophysiological facts,
Okay, yeah,
whatever facts. That's why I use the general term resources. Whatever it
okay,
is in the individual that would enable them to
okay,
to successfully rule follow. Yeah.
got it. Okay, so we have those grounding facts and the correspondence facts, which are the facts about what, uh, like what the world is actually like, or something like that.
What
Or
and what the terms pick out, what the terms that the person is using can pick out, what arithmetical function is actually being characterized by the person, what their term coconut lead, etc., pick out, etc. Yes, and
okay,
those would be the correspondence facts.
got it. Okay, and then so a lot of the so a straight solution, as we mentioned, is one that's trying to give a grounding fact, saying there is something about the person, either psychologically or neurophysiologically, that makes it the case that they mean this and always meant this in all these cases. Um, and you're denying that, as Kripke does. So we'll talk about, so like the reference magnetism and dispositionalism are both straight solutions of a sort, right?
That's right.
Okay. I had one, so just one clarification question. I think I get the distinction, but just in case people don't, or in case of misunderstanding, I had a question about this distinction. So would it hold on something like all kinds of content externalism? Because when you talk about, say, like the psychological facts about an individual, um, well, there's kind of a question in philosophy of whether the psychological facts about an individual are purely individualistic, like just about, say, the neurophysiological conditions, or maybe have something to do with what environment that person's in, either socially or in like
Hmm.
Putnam's sense, physically. So I wonder if, like, is there in every case a kind of distinction, or like maybe a certain kind of externalist would say that the grounding and correspondence facts come together, like a person's psychological states are in some cases constituted by the external world. I mean, this seems to be something Putnam says about like the Twin Earth case. Um, so is there this sharp distinction in the kind of externalism case, or you think is this a distinction that's supposed to hold in that kind of situation, or is this sort of on a kind of individualism?
Well, I'm focusing on the individualism approach, right? I do think that how we end up, how our language works, okay, that is to say, how we understand it to be operating, um, um, involves clearly involves externalism. I think that's why those intuitions work, the ones that Putnam brings up, that Burge brings up. Um, on the other hand, I want to say that there's a sense in which that's all a projection.
Okay.
That's the idea I have. So,
Right, yeah.
um, in other words, we, as it were, we talk a certain way, and then after the fact, we just get everything to fit, and we just go on. And yes, I was always referring to that, and I was always picking those things out. So that's how I understand what's going on with that stuff. But when I'm worrying about what resources a person has, um, I feel that if you're going to introduce externalist moves, you're essentially doing something along the lines of reference magnetism.
Okay. That's what I was, okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. That's kind of what I was thinking. Yeah, I don't wonder, I'd be curious to think more about that. Maybe that's something I'll email you about. But yeah, the sort of relation between the reference magnetism and a kind of like natural kind externalism is interesting.
Yeah,
So yeah, maybe we'll talk about more when we come to reference magnetism. But okay, that's just a question I had about the sort of grounding correspondence facts distinction. I mean, it makes sense, I think, at least sort of maybe pre-philosophically or pre-theoretically, when we're talking about the resources a person has to follow rules in isolation. Well, they're just the resources they have, like neurophysiologically and in
that's
some
right.
sense. So I think there's a I tend to be an externalist, but maybe you'll convince me otherwise. But even aside from that, I think there's a sort of register in which that's intuitive. So, okay, cool. Um, what else did I have about this? Okay, right. So the skeptical challenge that Kripke presents, the bizarre skeptic, it pressures these grounding facts. It says that,
That's right.
the words may refer to something in the world, but how does the person sort of grip onto that word and subsequently the world in the right kind of way? So whether or not the word corresponds to the kind in a certain kind of way, there's this question of, well, how does the person able to do it? Right?
That's right.
That's what the skeptic is questioning.
That's
So
right.
so a straight solution is trying to find something there, some connection between the like neurophysiological or psychological dispositional state of the person and the word and its meaning. And a skeptical solution just accepts there are no facts of that sort, right? And
That's right.
that's the kind of approach you're taking
That's
here
right.
as well. Okay.
And then I mean, some people like to use the term error theory. That's what I'm actually offering. I think error theory is misleading. I actually want to call it a projection,
Okay.
a projection view. That is to say, we are seeing language, seeing reference, and a certain way, and it's a way that works.
Okay.
Okay.
This is connected to some of the stuff in semantic perception, right? The
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, that's right. That's the idea. So, yeah, I want to say something about that right away because I know there's a debate about semantic perception where people are worrying about whether semantics is perceived as opposed to inferred. And I'm not participating in that debate. My notion of semantic perception was the idea was that we're projecting, we experience meaning as literally in the world in a certain sense. We see words involuntarily of our native language as having meanings.
Right.
That's the idea, even though there's nothing in the world that has any meanings.
Got it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I got from the paper you sent me and from the book a little bit is you maybe we'll talk about this when we get to the solution a little bit more, but you ultimately kind of take a something like Chomsky's I language notion on, right? That sort of like languages are individual and internal, and the kind of idea of a common like public language is sort of a projected illusion. Is that the
That's right.
right idea? Okay.
That's right. So we got to be careful though, because there are going to be people who are going to say that an I language can't be a language because you can't sort of get it wrong.
Oh, I
Okay.
see. Yeah, yeah.
But the public language is certainly one that we experience as one we can get wrong. I thought the word meant this, but it doesn't mean that.
Right. Yeah.
And Chomsky never really focuses on that kind of thing. He's always being polemical about, oh, a public language isn't worthy of scientific study because it's vague and it's like neighborhood and blah blah blah. But I think what's important is that we experience all our language transactions with one another. We experience as via public language that we've acquired. That's how we experience it. And so that's what I'm talking about when I talk about semantic perception. But what we're actually manipulating psychologically and neurophysiologically is an I language. And we get along with each other when we're talking to one another because our I languages overlap sufficiently, but not because we both grasp a public language that we share in common. That, however, is the experience, which is unavoidable.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's why it's not really an error theory. It's more like a hallucination theory, group hallucination theory. If you're going to be mean to me, that would be the way to be mean to me.
You shouldn't be giving people, yeah, don't give them the tools to be mean to you. Yeah, this is it's a public interview, you know.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll just say as an aside for viewers, if you're interested more in the I language stuff, I have an interview from a year or so ago with a friend of mine, Malhar Shah, who's a PhD student at Maryland, who works on syntax and generative grammar. And we did a whole like 2 hour interview on I language and
Great.
some of the Chomsky stuff. So if people are interested in kind of some of the background of this, they can watch that as well. Um, Okay, cool. Thanks for that. It's good. That's helpful. I feel like I'm taking us maybe off the rails here and there, but it's worth to cover some of the background. Um, I think maybe we don't need to go maybe explicitly through all of Kripke's conditions. Maybe they'll come out in the sort of uh, more critical elements we talk about. So I think
Mhm.
part of the book is not just advancing your new skeptical solution, but also criticizing some straight solutions. So namely
Right.
dispositionalism and uh, reference magnetism. So dispositionalism more or less just says, well, I mean plus and not quus because I'm like disposed to mean plus in this case in virtue of like all my past usages. And Kripke has a handful of really kind of prominent objections to this, but people have tried to salvage it in some ways. Um, so I guess I kind of gave the basic version, but how would you characterize like dispositionalist responses and maybe something of your reply to them?
Well, I mean, dispositional responses, I mean, they're different ones.
Right.
What they basically try to do is I almost want to say, um, make the dispositions more sophisticated, layer them in a certain way. I mean, the most obvious maneuver is sort of like, you know, to respond to the fact that, well, I'm disposed to give wrong answers. So, in a certain sense, I'm not really doing plus, I'm doing something else that involves all these wrong answers. And then the response is, yeah, but the disposition is to, to correct those, um, and in a certain way. So then you introduce other mechanisms that have been built in to, uh, uh, as it were, your disposition really is a much longer sort of thing. And you have to be careful because you can go counterfactual here, because after all, I don't know about your past arithmetical history, but my past arithmetical history is filled with mistakes that were never corrected. And I always think about that when I think about the disposition. Look at your past behavior, Kripke says. Well, Kripke was a prodigy. And so his past
Yeah.
behavior with arithmetic was probably spotless, but mine wasn't. And so I'm thinking to myself, I don't want to base my grasp of arithmetic on the examples that I actually carried out, most of which I got poor grades for and never were fixed. And the thought is you can go counterfactual, and maybe it'll work. You go counterfactual on the methods in a certain sense. And the problem I have is that I think ultimately that's going to be circular because even when you go counterfactual, there's still going to be other mistakes and there are going to be limitations and they're going to show up. And I don't see any way of getting out from under that. This is the part where I say, look, we're frail, mistaken beings. And so I think, ultimately, um, he's right. The problem is that um, grasping counting in a certain sense this way by finding dispositions in the person, it's not going to work because um, there are mistakes we can't rule out, and there are mistakes we can't even anticipate.
Yeah.
And that's what I think about that. And yeah,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, that leads well into the sort of one of the really sort of, as I understand it, prominent ways to try to salvage dispositionalism is to hedge it with this sort of like ceteris paribus clause,
yeah.
right? So Fodor makes this move, and I forget who else, but maybe Boghossian, maybe Horwich. I don't know for sure, but um, the idea is like, well, yes, you have this like mistake conditions, and they all these kind of like infinitude requirement and what have you, but we can kind of think of dispositions for a person to mean something like we think of like dispositions of natural objects have certain properties. So like, I don't know, water is disposed to boil at
Hmm.
a certain temperature, and maybe sand is supposed to like turn to glass at a certain kind of like electrical process hitting it. So we can think of, and these are all like ceteris paribus dispositions, right? Because they can be the physical conditions can be such that those properties aren't like induced in the right kind of way. So it said, well, we can just treat like our dispositions to add in the same way, like we're disposed, ceteris paribus, and there can be interference with that because of all kinds of conditions. But that's not really a problem to speaking about the dispositions as doing the work. Um, and you have a reply to this in the book, or maybe not talking about the book. What do you like? What is your response to that
Well,
kind of
yeah,
move?
I do have a reply. I actually look at that very kind of example, and now I'm trying to remember the details about what I said about it. But I don't quite remember where it is.
It's section 2.3. It's in there. I think I could probably try to find a page number too. If I remember, just going off the top of my head, it has something to do with you point out that there's a sort of asymmetry between in the natural object cases, we're talking about like a
Actual
dispos
structural facts.
yeah, like actual structural facts and a disposition that a thing has to do given like certain outside conditions or like interference. But with a person, we're talking about what they're disposed to like actually do and the kind of being disposed to do a thing as opposed to like being disposed to remain the same
Right.
is sort of asymmetrically different because if you talk about us being disposed to like mean the same thing, that's kind of presupposing that we mean the same thing, which is
Well,
exact.
yes. I mean, so the point I make about um, so we have salt dissolves in water,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is, look, the structural facts that underwrite the idealized description of glass salt gases um, determine the ways in which these idealized laws are false. So the whole point is, if you're going to say, salt dissolves in water, you're just wrong. It doesn't. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And what is it disposed to do? Exactly what it does do, built on the structural facts. Now, what's happening with counting is, and this is the point I'm developing. What I want to say is something like, look, if you're honest about your dispositional approach, so that you're really going to take what goes on with salt and things like that seriously, then you want to look at the structural conditions of salt to tell you exactly what salt is disposed to do. And that's what will happen. So let's do the same thing with counting. Well, we have done the same thing with counting. That's all the neurophysiological science that's been developed about what our counting resources are, how counting works, et cetera, et cetera. And guess what comes out at the end of the day? Not counting.
Right. Yeah.
So the point is, and this is in the paper, that the forthcoming paper, this is where I draw a disanalogy between what's going on. If Chomsky's picture of language was right and there was a language organ that gave us competence for language, that would tell us, along with the performance conditions, what our dispositions are. And there's no such thing like that when it comes to arithmetic. So what's happening
Right.
with
Yeah.
arithmetic is our dispositions, if you look at us, the honest thing to say is we're not disposed to count. Period. The end. What we're disposed to do is something that matches up well enough with counting for us to get by. And it's kind of like we actually count, let's be honest, in a very fudgy sort of way. We learn how to count some small numbers. Then on our second birthday or third birthday, we're given a calculator, or we rely on other people. That's what we're disposed to do. And yes, it deviates. Language I've used in other writing at times, as I said, we don't count, we simulate counting. That's what we do. Okay. So that's the claim, ultimately. That's what, I don't know if I quite say that in the book, but that's what I'm saying now.
That works. Yeah, you can say it now. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to. So, yeah, just for clarification, what does it mean to say that we don't count, we simulate counting? I mean, what is counting if not like what we do
Well,
with
no,
numbers?
I actually think well, now this turns on something else, right? This turns on my earlier picture that I was giving you about, what we do with, we idealize reference, we idealize these relations, and we idealize arithmetic in the same way. So that what we're going to do is treat arithmetic as, the counting relation. Let's just talk about the counting relation. We're going to treat it as something that we can recognize at any time that we failed to carry out successfully. So what we'll do is we'll say, um, look, there was a mistake here, or there was a mistake there. And we'll say, that's not the counting relation. This is the counting relation. But if you ask, how do we have access to the actual counting relation? Well, the answer is we don't.
Right.
No
Yeah.
more than we have access to the extension of lead.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, I think. Yeah, good. I like the sort of asymmetrical point with natural objects. I think you also on page 26 you make this sort of in principle point that like no matter what the dispositions are, no matter what the dispositions are, no matter what dispositions we have, we can always sort of intelligibly ask the question, whether or why they're the right ones or whether why they give the right answers.
That's
It
right.
seems like just sort of in principle, dispositions aren't going to be the kind of thing that are going to be able to solve this problem because you can always ask in virtue of which you have the dispositions and in virtue of which they give you the right answers. Like it seems like that's always going to be intelligible to ask. There has to be something
It's
else.
right. And why is it intelligible to ask? Not because of some normativity issue that's kicking in, but because dispositions are rooted in what the person does and what the person is inclined to do. And that's separate from our understanding of what counting is.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that's our understanding of counting. You could imagine that we changed it. We said, you know what? We don't like this projection theory you have, Jody. So we're going to treat counting as what most people do, et cetera, something like that. That's the same kind of maneuver that I was talking about in knowledge and reference when I said replace the term lead with all these other lead words that are linked to the very procedures that are used in those cases to pick out instances, successfully or unsuccessfully. And then you have this horrible language. And so the claim I'm ultimately going to say is something like the reason why we treat arithmetic the way we do, and the language and mathematics has to do because we don't want to end up with this kind of language or this kind of thing. Okay, so we're going to treat what counting is as, you know, different from what we do. What we do can always deviate.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and it seems like there's a sense in which that has to be what we're asking if we're going to generate the paradox, right? Because we're asking how what we do matches up with this thing. If counting was simply defined as just whatever we did, there would be no question. Like, how do we manage to do what we in fact do? I mean, there's nothing to say, right? Like, so
That's
the
right. But what I'm pointing out is that the burden is on me once I've told the kind of story I'm telling you, the projection story. Why do we want to talk about arithmetic that way as something we don't attach to our dispositions? And I think there's a story that can be told, right? So I mean, if you've got a projection, you want to say, well, why? Why do we want to do this? I mean, that's a funny question in a way. We do it. We do it automatically. So that's the answer. But then, the question is, why is that a good thing?
yeah, yeah, it's good. Yeah, and I think that should summarize it for everybody. Hopefully, if not, we can come back to it maybe. Um, but I think maybe we won't harp on this too much, but there's Kripke kind of raises the possibility of like a sociological dispositionalism. So you can just locate the dispositions in like the community of speakers as opposed to the individual. And both he and you point out that that's going to face all the same problems. Um, right? Like everything you can
Right. It
say.
kicks it kicks the can down the road, as the cliche
Yeah.
goes, because you do get some of the things you want. You get correction. You get, that there's something that somebody's supposed to learn that's different from, what they as an individual are disposed to do. Right. Great. But you've got the same problem at the societal level. And in fact, historically, this happens. I believe it's the Babylonians that we think were mistaken about a certain fraction.
Okay.
And that's all of them collectively, the entire community. That's how we're going to think about this. Yeah, a straight solution, is just a lot of people together as opposed to one person, and it's not going to solve the problems. You know, there's something important, right? That's how I want to put it. It's built into our arithmetical practices, our practices with language, all of these things that we separate explicitly dispositions from um, what the term really picks out or what the
Yeah.
arithmetical relation really is. And to me, this is the full content of the normativity. There's nothing deeper.
Okay. Good. Yeah. I think so. I think that covers what I was going to ask about next, but let me just mention it anyways, because there is a. I mentioned this, I think, earlier in the interview, but there's a recent paper from 2020 by Jared Warren.
Yes.
Are you familiar with Jared Warren at all?
I am somewhat familiar with it. I'm not sure I'm familiar enough with the paper to give a criticism
Yeah, I'll just give you the
that I'm
basic
being
idea.
filmed doing, you know. But yeah, I mean, he's trying to revive dispositionalism, and it's a very sophisticated
Yeah.
approach, but I don't think it works.
Yeah, I was
Um,
gonna say because I think I was reading back over the paper a bit this morning because I wrote a paper responding to it years ago, but I don't quite remember what I said. So I was reading back over Warren's paper, and yeah, it's a defense of dispositionalism that more or less just tries to really fine grain the dispositions is the way I'd put it. So he says, well, of
yeah,
course, maybe like I don't have the disposition to add this sort of astronomical set of numbers. But what I maybe have the disposition to do is take the first step in a very simple first step in an arithmetical process that will compositionally end up giving me the answer. So he uses an analogy with like a bookshelf, like Ludwig, take it a subject, he may not have a disposition to build a like 1,000 foot tall bookshelf, but he can have the disposition to like put one shelf kind of on top of two things and then the next one. So Warren's approach generally is just trying to say, well, if we separate simple and composite dispositions and say that, well, I might only have the composite disposition to mean plus in virtue of having this much simpler disposition to like take a very minimal first step in an arithmetical process. Well, if you characterize dispositionalism this way, then it kind of helps with the sort of like infinitude requirements, right? Because even if the person is never going to, I think what he says is that the sort of like their meaning to complete the function is sort of embedded in their taking the first step in virtue of the fact that they would in fact complete it, complete the sort of arithmetic problem given enough time, right? So it's kind of a way of just fine graining the dispositions, making them much like in a way psychologically easier, and
mhm.
then saying that the set of them all is going to like compositionally count as like a disposition to mean green instead of grew or plus instead of quus. Um, that's the basic approach. I mean, the paper is very technical. It's like 30 pages
Yeah.
long, but that's the sort of simple. And I think kind of what you, this sort of, that's why part of why I wanted to bring up this in principle point of yours. I think it's sort of, you get the same result here, right? Like whatever you're disposed to do in that first step and whether or not that accords with the right compositional process is kind of exactly what's in question, right? So I don't know. Does that sound any more plausible to you than the other dispositionalist stuff? Or?
Look, I mean, I think the right thing to say is it could happen, although here's how I want to say it. Yeah, I want to agree that the objection to the dispositional approach isn't that it's impossible to to design a creature with dispositions that would actually carry out the arithmetical operation. That's not really what the issue is. The issue is that we are um, we are making the arithmetical um, operation mean a certain thing. We want to mean a certain thing by plus or green or lead or whatever. And then we deal with the actual dispositions we have in a certain way in relation to that. Okay, that's what's going on in a certain sense. And I want to say, if that's right, then this is another version of Kripke's normativity point,
Yeah.
but without the normativity. It's saying, look, we're doing different things here. Okay. And if you want to understand how language works, you have to realize that's what's happening. And so to try to figure out how you can endow us with the appropriate dispositions um, is to miss the point.
Right. Okay, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I also think is a minor point, but you sent me, I read this paper you sent me on the phenomenology of rule following, and Warren in the paper kind of says repeatedly that the point applies just as well to natural language as to arithmetic, but it's much less clear how it does because the process he describes, the simple composite disposition distinction, is like really arithmetically grounded, right? And it
Yeah.
seems like that mischaracterizes the phenomenology of like meaning something by a word. Like when I mean to use the word green, I don't like start a process that incrementally gets me to like meaning green. I just say the word, right? Doesn't seem like the sort of incremental dispositions really come into play in natural language as much.
And
But
they also, by the way, don't come into play. And Kripke makes this point in a footnote, as he so often does. He makes important points in footnotes. There's a great deal of mathematics, which doesn't look like arithmetic at all, which we grasp. We grasp the concept of, for example, a transcendental function. And I don't know how to tell a story about how we're supposed to grasp the concept of a transcendental function that is going to look like what we do when we understand counting or arithmetic or something like that. And the reason is because we understand that a lot of our mathematical concepts, even if we have only the weakest idea of what their instances would look like. Okay. So a
right,
lot of
yeah.
mathematics is like that, where you prove that. So what you do is you take, you call a number. Um, well, the idea is you can prove by contradiction. There are people that don't like this. You prove by contradiction that there are more. For example, there are more real numbers than rational numbers, right? And you have some rough idea of how you're supposed to think of real numbers, but most of the instances of real numbers you can't get to them by a process that you have no dispositions to do
Right.
this. And so there's a lot of language takes a lot of forms. All our terms do. And as terms get more theoretical, we still feel we grasp them, but we're losing. We don't have a disposition to pick out instances of any
Right.
of these things. So there's a sense in which, even if you can come up with terms that you could tell a dispositional story about, it hardly captures most of what's going on with reference.
Right. Okay. Good. That's a nice statement of it.
And,
And that
and I mean, Kripke, I forgot where he does it, but there's a little footnote where he says something to the effect of, I don't, because Kripke knows this stuff better than anybody. He says, I don't know how we're supposed to apply the rule following problem for this. This may be connected with Wittgenstein's finitism, because then there's a tendency to think, well, if I can't tell a story even in principle of rule following, then I don't grasp those concepts.
right, yeah.
Yeah, but um, yeah, there's a saying about babies and bathwater that comes into play here.
Right. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. It's a helpful summary, I think, of some of the dispositionalism stuff. And talking about reference and Jared Warren actually both bleed well into the next thing we'll maybe cover a bit briefly before talking about your positive suggestion, which is reference magnetism. So Warren has a paper from a little while ago called just simply called Reference Magnetism Does Not Exist, which is a fun paper. People should go check it out. Um,
Oh,
but so this is an approach that,
yeah, I don't think it exists either. So great.
right? So yeah, you guys are
We're on the
one
same
and
page there.
And he's also a conventionalist. You guys have some similar affinities in like philosophy of logic and
Yeah,
math.
we're not conventionalists in the same way. I can say why briefly, very
Sure, yeah.
briefly, because I actually read a large chunk of his book.
Oh,
And the
cool.
reason is because I think his picture of natural language is wrong,
Okay.
linguistically wrong. That's basically the problem. There's a way in which he thinks uh, standard logic is exhibited by natural language. And it seems to me the one thing the linguistics has shown pretty conclusively is that whatever is going on with logic and natural language, it is not standard logic. There are little pieces of it. but even they don't fit well. I mean, syllogism, for example, is the closest thing, and syllogism doesn't function quite the way it does in formal logic. Um, and then you have modus ponens, and it doesn't quite function the way it does either. And or, they don't function the same
Right.
way.
Yeah.
And then there's a great deal of what should be called reasoning, logic that occurs in natural languages, which is really occurring in the lexicon. And we don't even have a good understanding of what's part of it and what isn't, what's part of natural language and what we're bringing in. So
Yeah.
my view is that that kind of conventionalism, that turns on these strong assumptions about what natural language is right is a non-starter.
Okay. Interesting.
So
Cool.
that's
Yeah.
where I disagree with him. I disagree with him on the linguistics.
Interesting. Okay. I think most people get off the boat a different place with
Yeah.
his stuff, but that's cool. Yeah, so in terms of reference magnetism, this is another uh family, I guess, of straight solutions. So it has this origins in this paper by Lewis, but the not the terminology doesn't come from him. Um, so I've been doing the summarizing, but I'm not as comfortable with the magnetism stuff. So what's reference magnetism and how is it supposed to sort of help be a straight solution to the rule following?
Well, roughly speaking, the idea is something like this: is built. It's a constraint on our terms that they pick out. Um, so the idea is you start by thinking about GRU, and you think about quadding instead of adding, and so roughly speaking, you have all these alternatives out there in space that your terms could pick out. So your term count could pick out actual counting or could pick out quounting. Your term green could pick out green things, all and only green things. That's the extension. So this is all about worrying about extensions. Or it could pick out GRU, which is something that's green up until 3000 and then blue thereafter. And the idea is that metaphysically, the universe extensions are not all on a par. So some extensions are elite, other ones aren't. There's a gradation of these things. And our language, and now there are different stories about how this is supposed to happen. Maybe it's an a priori stipulation. Maybe it's it's built into the semantics in some way. Our terms pick out the elite classes. So, as Lewis sometimes puts it, or close to how he was going to put it, we don't determine the extensions of our terms. We can't. That's what Kripke has shown. That's what Putnam showed with his um, um, arguments. It's us and the world together. So
Okay,
that the
right.
world is set up a certain way, and that's what enables our terms to pick out what they're supposed to pick out. So it's a substantial metaphysical assumption, okay, or it's a substantial. Well, ultimately, it's a metaphysical assumption because you can build your semantic. You can say, "Here's how my semantics work," and then you still have to answer the question. Well, how is the semantics getting us our terms to the right items? And so the world has to help.
Right.
And so that's the picture. And so basically, my argument comes down to, and again, I mean, all of this is, Kripke at one point says, look, all my objections really amount to the same thing. There's against the dispositional approach, it's misguided because it's not providing justification. So there's a normative thing. So it's
Right, yeah.
missing, it's descriptive. So in a way, all my objections boil down to the same thing. What's the objection? It boils down to do not be too arrogant, human being, and give yourself faculties, abilities to reach into the world in a way that you haven't the resources for doing.
Right. Yeah. is a way of putting, I think you call it in the book the sensitivity demand, right? So like you
Yeah,
can
that's
make,
right. I said we don't have antennas for elite classes,
yeah,
and our language doesn't have antennas, and you're not telling any story about how they could. That's
right.
right.
Yeah, I mean, make one of the way you put it is like, look, make the world as like metaphysically structured, however you want, as rich as you want. It's still that's still not telling us how like the subject is sensitive to how their use of words actually like picks these things out or attaches to them, and
Right.
that's just not, that has to be part of the story. That's what we're trying to ask. Um,
That's right. And it's a kind of objection I've raised earlier against Platonism. It comes down often to the same thing, which is, make metaphysical entities as lovely as you want. Now tell me how I get access to them. I mean, people may think Plato's approach isn't sensible, reincarnation, and you've lived before, and but that's the he's giving an answer to that question.
right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have to write some sort of causal contact. Um,
Yes, something.
yeah, I wonder. Hmm. Yeah, I was gonna ask about, I mean, yeah, we talked about externalism a little bit before, but I guess because right, this is sort of, I guess they're a little bit differently related because I know Lewis doesn't end up being like a direct reference theorist in the same way that, like, say, Putnam and Kripke are, but it
No,
seems like,
he wants to go descriptivism all the way.
right.
That's right, and he gives reasons for that,
So with
which
your
I
point,
forgot.
yeah, I need to look at them too. You need to read Scott Soames's book about this, but it's, who has the time? Um, I mean, so would the kind of the same point apply to a kind of like causal externalism, right? The idea is it's part of a condition on meaning that you have to be in causal contact with the natural kinds. Would you say the same thing then? Like there's still like the question then of how you sort of attach like your language to the natural kinds, even if you have this sort of causal contact with the world?
Well, I like the idea that we have causal contact with the world, but the thing is, we only have causal contact to a small part of it.
Right. Yeah.
And and I called this in knowledge and reference and empirical science. I think I called this the either the scope problem or the idea was you don't want the term lead to only pick out the items of lead that you've been in touch with. You want to extend it
Yeah.
to all instances, and then people have different ways of trying to do this is when people drag in counterfactuals to try to get access. And my view is that you know it doesn't work. That's what's happening. That's ultimately what the story is. So the story I want to tell ultimately is one in which, as we go along, we fix it all up. Oh, those
Yeah.
were not. And that's where the epistemic language comes in literally. We fault all our procedures. Yeah, those were false positives. That was not lead. This is lead, etc. Here are new methods. Here are better methods. And we just treat the term is continuing to refer to the same thing that we want. And that tells you what the machinery is that we're actually using. And on my view is that's fine. And then we talk as if it picks out everything we wanted it
Yeah.
to pick out. But there's a way in which that claim is never going to be refuted by anything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I say I won't harp on this point anymore, just give people something to read in the book, but there's also a cool discussion of Tarski biconditionals you give here, you apply this here, and then also this sort of a little bit of information on linguistic practice, so like the science of semantics and how the notion of reference that's going to be worked out there is going to be more complicated than the sort of determinate sense of reference that Lewis needs for the argument to go through. So
Oh
there's
yeah,
some empirical reason to think that this won't work either, right?
right. I mean, what's happening there is that's a kind of almost a more localized debate about what our language looks like and what's going on in it. And the thing is that when you look at our ordinary words, when you really start to pay attention to them, you realize they don't. The kind of thing we see with Tarski reference doesn't show up in natural language.
Right. Yeah.
That's basically um, That's basically the issue. So again, this comes back to the fact that um, those philosophers who insist on looking at natural language through the lens of a formalism of this sort, the Tarski formalism, or the generalizations of it and the family of it, are not seeing natural language clearly. And so they're thinking that our practices with reference have a certain form that they just don't. So yeah,
Right. Okay.
that's yeah.
Okay. All right. So we've gone over some of the critical materials, so it's maybe time to turn positive, and talk a little bit about your positive suggestions. So this sort of new option in logical space of a sort of truth conditional skeptical solution. Um, and I have some questions about this material in the book too, so this will be fun to talk
Okay.
about. So it's kind of built on this sort of Crusoes, as you call them, so sort of private rule followers, isolated individuals. So there's five of them, I believe.
Yeah.
We don't have time to go through all of them, so we should leave people something to read in the book. But you end with, Crusoe's 4 and 5, which are more psychologically realistic. And Crusoe 5's language is supposed to be sort of relevantly similar to ours in lots of ways, as I understand it. Um, and so maybe we should say something a little bit about the Crusoes. So they all speak, as I understand, what you call disposition meaning languages, right? Um, languages where is that just the first two Crusoe, the first three? But I thought they all kind of spoke disposition meaning languages, but then with Crusoe 5, there are also the um, PLPCI dispositions. There's kind of an
Well, what
augmentation.
so the picture is something like this with the later languages. The idea is like us, we don't have access to our own dispositions. We have access to what we want to do in the moment, but we don't have access to the machinery that's giving rise to the dispositions. That's
Right.
the idea. So it doesn't feel to us when we use language that we're in the grip of any urges or anything like that. So that's the way I picture it. And so the idea is that nevertheless, what's actually happening, what's really happening with these individuals is what kind of really happens with us, which is as we engage in activities, right? Counting, playing tennis, whatever, we uh, we're literally over time refining and improving our dispositions. That's not how we experience it. We experience ourselves as getting better at the task.
Right.
That's the idea. But what's actually happening is simply that we are modifying. We're not modifying. This is an evolutionary benefit for us. What happens is um, we quote get better at certain things. So we're moving a little differently, or we're double checking a calculation in a certain way that we wouldn't have before, et cetera, et cetera. And the upshot is that the outcomes are more successful. Okay, and more successful can be understood globally. That is to say, in the Caruso cases, they are successfully counting the coconuts. They're successfully recognizing coconuts. We can put it that way.
Yeah.
And the idea is because they don't have access to their own inner workings, they can only think about these things in terms of the objects they're engaging with. So what happens is they see themselves as getting better at recognizing coconuts and getting better at um, counting and things like that. So what I'm doing there is I'm saying what I'm actually doing is I'm telling the projection story that I'm telling, but then I'm explaining why that projection story is so natural to us and to Crusoe, right?
Yeah. Okay.
That's the
Yeah.
idea that
Yeah.
the projection story is natural to us because precisely because we don't have access to certain things psychologically that are going on. So the right way to think, one way to think about it, I don't say it's the right way. I say, you could think about it this way, is that as someone improves, they're shifting on their disposition languages. They're speaking one, then they're speaking another, then they're speaking another, and the dispositional languages from a certain angle are better. That is to say, the creature survives,
Right.
is more successful. But they don't think of themselves as speaking different languages, right? So the languages differ because each language picks out all and only the coconuts the individual is disposed to. I'm sorry, all and only the items that the individual is disposed to um, call a coconut. Okay. So that's a different use of the word coconut than later when, say, some of the other bad coconuts are excluded or squirrels are excluded and some other coconuts that were hard to see are included, right? That's a different use of the word coconut. And so they're speaking different languages over time but they don't see it that way. They see it as I'm using the same word coconut. I'm just getting better at recognizing coconuts.
I see. Okay.
Okay. So the
Yeah.
content of different languages is recalibrated as epistemic.
Okay.
That's the idea. So
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, so one thing that wasn't, so that's a helpful gloss. One thing that wasn't super clear to me from the text at every point was whether or not the Crusoe cases are supposed to be like analogous to our language practice. It seems like that's what you suggest with Crusoe 5. But you mentioned earlier
yes,
in the interview that some part of this is like a thought experiment of like there possibly could be beings of a certain sort that had a private language. So the claim is not just that like you could tell a coherent thought experiment, right? At least maybe that's the case with like Crusoe's 1 and 2, but when we get to 5, Crusoe 5's like language is relevantly like ours, right? So this is supposed to be sort
that's
of
right.
okay.
That's the idea. That when we get to him, we've got somebody that's psychologically close to us. Okay. But the idea is that the earlier examples illuminate the sense in which we can see five as engaged
Yeah.
in still using dispositional languages of a certain sort. They're continuously changing. And that's the idea that that's what's happening with us. Okay. Now there are people that are going to want to say, and if they want to say this, they can, and then I just have to change how I'm talking about this a little bit. They might want to say, look, those dispositional languages aren't languages because they don't have
Right.
correctness conditions. And so my response is going to be, look, you can, I see a language as an empirical object. So what it turns out to be is what it turns out to be, period, the end. But never mind that. If that's how you want to talk, then you'll call um, the use that Crusoe 5 makes of the words like coconut, et cetera, et cetera. That's his language. And then these things that I'm calling dispositional languages, you might call structural language elements or something like that. This is all terminology.
You're right.
And I
Yeah.
don't think it's going to affect the point I'm trying to make one way or the other.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, because this relates to a question I had. I had a couple questions about the sort of the cruise, like some of this, and one of them was along these lines, and it was you say that right, like going on the projection story, like he takes himself to be saying, "Oh, well, um, when I don't get drunk and I rest well, I recognize coconuts better than I did
That's right.
yesterday." And it from his point of view, he's using the same word coconut that he used yesterday, but from what you call like the God's eye view, or from like the sort of stance independent view, what's actually happening is not that he's using the same word coconut, but just that his language itself and the words he's using are constantly shifting, and he's just kind of getting better at navigating the world. Right? Is that kind of the
Yes.
Right. And so I mean, the question I had, which I think talking about maybe couching this in like the I language stuff helps a little bit characterizing it for me, but that was my question reading this was, okay, well, if his language is constantly shifting from the God's eye view and he's just wrong about this, I mean, in what sense does he have a private language, like the A there being operative? It doesn't seem like he has a private language. It seems like he has just a sort of constantly shifting flux of languages or language-like practices. And someone might think that that diminishes the results of like, okay, yeah, well, this isn't an instance of a private language. This is just an instance of a person having continually shifting language-like behavior. But your claim, I take it, is going to be that that is right, but it's not insignificant because that's exactly the same with our language.
That's right.
Okay.
And and furthermore, it's going to um, capture the phenomena. And what phenomena is that? How a person could, all by themselves, get better at recognizing coconuts, doing arithmetic, et cetera, correct themselves, what content that idea of correction would have. It's going to be described in this I language way, if we put it that way. But it's going, instead of saying the person is now doing arithmetic better or recognizing coconuts better, we say instead, well, what's going on is they've discarded various I languages for good that don't help them in the world as well as other ones do. And that's an objective fact.
I see. You're right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, you can put it that way. And I'm saying, well, that's the content of what it means to say they're getting better at something or they're correcting themselves. And we talk this way, and you know. So I'm claiming I've captured everything. I've
Yeah.
captured all the phenomena. And you're unhappy because the word correct doesn't do something you want it to do anymore. But I'm saying, well, it's doing what we need, which is, you
Right.
know, you know, Crusoe can say, I was wrong about that coconut. That wasn't a coconut. And we have a way of explaining what he means.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think so. It's helpful. Like, yeah, this is helpful to clarify the dialectic, right? Because part of the consideration about rule following and part of the reason your solution is a skeptical one is generally the sort of point is like, look, okay, in virtue of what do I mean the same thing by a word? Well, I mean the same thing by the word as I did yesterday in virtue of following some rule. And your reply is kind of teasing these apart a bit, right? Because like, he is following a rule, but he doesn't mean the same thing by the word that he did yesterday. So like
Right,
we're looking at we're looking to rule following to explain the wrong kind of thing. Uh,
right.
and we're kind of like the criteria for whether or not something counts as rule following should be shifted away from whether or not the meaning stays the same and just to like how well they do at navigating various problems and navigating the
That's
world.
right.
Okay.
And how well they do at specific tasks, like
Yeah.
counting,
Hmm.
and how we can and what kind of gloss we can put on it. We can put the following gloss on it. You made a mistake. And then
Yeah.
someone tells me, well, what does that really mean? And I say, well, here's what that really means. And then all these I languages show up, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Okay, yeah, I think that covered I had a question about that as I covered that. Yeah, the one thing I'd ask too then, okay, so this is something maybe I think comes up more in the Wittgenstein exegesis material than it does in some of the Kripke stuff, but it's like what notion of privacy is going on. Because I think my read on it at least is that Wittgenstein wouldn't necessarily disagree in one sense, but he also would disagree with the sort of characterization of language this way. But so about the Crusoes, the question is like, okay, in what sense are they speaking a private language? Because if it seems like the same as ours, then it doesn't seem like it's going to count as private in the sense Wittgenstein was really talking about privacy, which was a private language is one that no one can in principle understand other than the individual. Like no one else can even in principle understand it. Like the person who's the last speaker of a dialect alive doesn't count. They just happen to be the last person alive. Uh, in order for language to be private in the sense Wittgenstein's worried about, it has to be that no one could in principle understand it. But is that the case with the Crusoes? Because it seems like five, if he's like us, well, we can understand each other. Like we do understand each other's languages, at least to some extent, right? So I mean,
Well,
if we could observe,
we understand in the way that Chomsky allows users of the same I languages to understand each other. Okay. And in the book, I do explore some of the issues with this, where I'm like using God for that purpose and asking, what can God understand?
right?
And there are things that God can't understand because he can't translate the language into his language. And so
Mhm.
there's always going to be issues like that coming up. But that's not really the private language argument that I was dealing with was a specific one. It wasn't this one,
Right.
right? It was the one that Kripke is concerned with, which is, yeah, can we, as it were, make sense of the idea of somebody doing something? Now I'll just put it this way: language like,
Yeah.
okay, in isolation, where there's no in principle being interpreted from the outside. So that, and my claim was, yes, you can. And the key element is one we haven't dwelt on a lot, but it's the element of how the language practices that Crusoe 5 is engaged in get better.
Right.
So that's the key idea. And it's always, if you've got a series of language practices, we didn't dwell on this, but the language, we kind of assumed it. The language practices are ones in which the later languages are uh, enable the person to be more successful than the earlier ones. And that's crucial to making private language in this sense work. If it doesn't do that, if it's arbitrary, if it flips around or whatever, then it won't work. Then it won't happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the notion of making a mistake, etc., they depend on the fact that the sequence of languages is going in the right direction. That is to say, maximizing survival.
Yeah, the induction of the you think you got like generally positive success curves, right?
Exactly.
So Crusoe's dispositions are to count, say for example, are changing over time because he's getting better at inducing success, getting better at
Well,
interacting
that's
with the
how we're
environment.
going to put it. He's doing better, but again, that's an epistemic gloss. The What you've got is a series of languages where the using the later languages is more engenders more success than the earlier languages. That's the idea, and so you can characterize retrospectively what you did earlier was a mistake in this respect or a mistake in that respect. That's
Uh,
the idea.
Okay. Yeah, something
So
like the
yeah. So notice the skeptical solution that Kripke offers says, here's how we're going to understand making a mistake. It's because it's subject to correction by others. In my approach, here's how we're going to make sense of making a mistake. It's subject to correction by yourself at a later point if the curve is going in the right direction of your
right.
series of languages.
Yeah, right. You say you think you where did I have the citation for this? So on page 83, yeah, you talk about this, that you don't need an external standard's not needed. That's kind of what's taken in the Kripke point to be required. But as long as you have, I think the two elements you point out are as long as there's like defeasibility, right? There's the recognition by Crusoe
Yeah,
5 that he can be wrong in some cases, and there's a practice of correction, then that's all you need, because then he can say at a later date, oh yeah, my defeasible usage 2 days ago was wrong because, I used the
right.
word coconut or I used the word count, but I actually like counted seven instead of eight. So now I'm going to correct myself and I'm going to use, and it'd be this new word, which unbeknownst to him is part of a new language, count or coconut to pick out the sort of collection of things
Right.
in like a
So he
more,
doesn't see himself as using a new word, but he
right.
is. Exactly.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And it's a new word. I forget. This is a basic question. Sorry. But like in virtue of what is it a new word? Just that it's inducing
His
more.
dispositions have changed.
Okay.
So it's a new word because he has now a disposition to not identify certain things as coconuts, which he did identify before. But his way of speaking about it is to say, I thought those were coconuts and they weren't.
Right.
Okay. And when I use the word coconut, that's why the poor book is littered with these little
Oh, the C
R's
indexes. Yeah. Yeah.
to distinguish the word coconut, which I didn't do in the language because I use coconut from my standpoint.
Right.
But the point is that coconut, certain coconuts in earlier language are not coconuts in later language. But he doesn't recognize that he's speaking a different language, so he just says those aren't coconuts.
Okay. Yeah. So
Yeah,
anytime like a subject disposition change, they're using a new word.
right.
This is okay. It's interesting. There's a because I think the more common view maybe in philosophy is maybe this interesting point to talk about divergence. It seems to me the more maybe like the received wisdom or whatever on how do we individuate words, and I guess one common suggestion is like their origins. Like when a word is introduced, and recently some philosophers, Ty and Sainsbury, have defended the same view for concepts, but and they kind of build their case on just well, it's the same, it's analogous with words, and they go off of that. The idea is that like words are sort of individuated by their origins. Like when a word water is introduced to refer to H2O, it has that meaning or at least that reference sort of atemporally, right? So whatever dispositions people, I mean, people might have dispositions to apply the word to things that aren't H2O, like in a twin earth case, but they're just going to be wrong because of
Mhm.
the word being individuated
That's right.
historically. So this is a
That's
different
how
proposal, right?
that's how Crusoe 5 understands his language, just that way.
But he's wrong, right? Like the words
But
aren't individuated that way.
well, I mean, look, this is why I do this weird stuff in the last chapter. I mean, there are two ways to think about this. One way to think about this is
Oh,
I'm
right.
really describing to you the standard view, but I'm saying here's this machinery that's underneath the standard view that explains, what's grounding uh, and what's failing to ground, but it's okay. Um, you know, how we use these words. The other way to think about it is that it's an illusion. This way of individuating words is an illusion. What's really going on is there's a sequence of languages, only we can't talk that way, so we don't. And, you know, so there's another book that we haven't mentioned of mine called Objects Without Borders,
Oh, yeah.
where I kind of try to throw cold water on the idea of individuation conditions. And I say,
Right.
look,
Yeah.
individuation conditions aren't in the world, ontological individuation conditions. They're things we project. So, so the question here is, how do we want to individuate words? And one of the things we can talk about is how we intuitively do so, and then we get the standard picture if we do that. And then the other thing is we get this other picture, which I'm not saying is really different, where there are these different languages. So we're individuating words differently. Is there a fact of the matter about how words should be individuated? I don't think so.
Cool.
So I want to
Yeah.
say these are two ways of looking at the same thing. At least that's what I'm inclined to want to say.
Right. Okay. Yeah, good. I think that's an interesting point of divergence with some philosophers. Maybe not that divergent. So is this the contrastivist, non-contrastivist stuff you talk about in the last
Yes.
chapter?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. That's where this is coming up in the book. Yeah.
Okay. So there's two ways to kind of maybe interpret the results, and depending on
Yeah.
how taken you are with the individuation conditions, you might go one way or the other.
Or the other way.
Right.
That's right.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I'll need to look back at that. Maybe send you a message about it or something. I need to look back at the that material because I was bit busy while reading it, but it was fun. Okay, good. I think that's a helpful gloss, and it's a helpful gloss on maybe some of the I don't want to say like not background assumptions, but like sort of other theoretical things that are going on here. And yeah, the ontology without borders stuff is interesting too. Like yeah, I mean it's right that the individuation conditions aren't out there in the world somewhere. That's sort of the reference magnetist stuff coming back in a little bit,
That's
right?
right. That's
Um,
right.
there's something we
Yeah, it's always
project.
there's a
Yeah.
big lesson here. I mean, maybe uh, all my work should be a footnote to Dan Dennett's remark at one point that there were no sky hooks.
Oh yeah. it's from Darwin's Dangerous Idea, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah, yeah. I don't want to think of my work that way, but I mean that's certainly an inclination to say no, 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 we don't. It's everything has to be explained in terms of how we're managing to do this.
right. Okay. It's fun. Yeah, so I don't want to keep you too long because that's a helpful
Okay.
summary. Maybe we should say something very briefly about where this diverges from Kripke's solution in another way, which is that Crusoe 5's language has truth conditions. Um, and we talked about this a little bit before, right? So there's no, you're kind of not quite a deflationist, but deflationist
No, no,
about
I'm a neutralist. So the
neutralist.
idea
Yeah.
is Kripke's really understanding truth conditions as demanding correspondence and correspondence for every instance, as it were. So the point is, if the grounding conditions manage some truth conditions, but not enough, we truth conditions are out. But on my view, truth conditions don't require any correspondence.
Right.
And the reason my position is neutralist is because, you know, there are some truth conditions and sometimes there are. I mean, there are some correspondence facts related to what's making a sentence true or false, and sometimes there aren't. That's the way to put it. And and so that's the neutralism. But that's again, that has to do with the fact that I think truth conditions can be understood this way. Okay. And they don't require correspondence. And when I say truth conditions can be understood this way, I mean the formalism, I mean our ordinary ways of speaking about truth, all of it. Okay.
Right. Okay. So yeah, the idea is if you sorry, you can continue.
I was just going to say, and so that's why there's no need to move to anything like assertability conditions.
Right. Yeah, it's like the move to assertability conditions sort of depends on understanding truth as requiring a correspondence relation, right?
Exactly.
If you drop that requirement on truth, then you don't need to give up truth conditions
Right.
uh, for
But of
Crusoe
course,
5
it's
or
never a
Fresh.
simple matter of just dropping that requirement. You have to
Right.
show that how we understand truth doesn't require it. And so that's a lot of work. That's
Yeah.
another book or articles, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think funny enough, we've kind of come circle, but I think we covered a good bit of some of your thinking about that towards the beginning. So hopefully
Right.
now the context of that in relation to the rule following stuff should make more sense with your positive proposal. Um, but yeah, I mean, obviously there's plenty more we could talk about, but I feel like I've kept you long enough. But have I missed anything sort of substantial you think about the case? Anything I haven't asked about that is really like important to get across?
I don't know. I don't think so, but that could just be, we've been at it for so long that it looks to me like, I did my best to explain. One thing I just want to say, it just occurs to me periodically, I think about Plato, thinking that writing is this awful thing that you do when you can't have dialogue. And I'm thinking to myself, with philosophy, dialogue is great, but really, uh, to really be careful, you have to write it down. And
Yeah.
that's what I always think. So, I always think to myself, when I'm talking, I'm just not doing as good a job as when I'm writing. I don't know
Well,
if that's true or not, but that's how it feels to me all the time.
yeah, I actually, it's funny, I feel the opposite. Maybe it's 'cause I'm a really bad writer, but I feel like I'm better at talking about philosophy than I am at writing it. Maybe that says more about my writing ability than anything.
It may say
Um,
something about your writing ability, and it just may be say something about your picture of your writing ability. I mean, you have to
yeah,
realize that these things are really subjective.
yeah, that's true as well. I mean, for what it's worth, I think, this has gone very well, and I also think the written version of it in the book is really cool and clear. I think I should mention one thing about the book to people is even if you're not interested in like rule following itself and just interested in some of the attendant issues about language. I mean, the book's worth the price of admission just for the chapter on reference magnetism. Um, so, a lot of the material in there is independent, but as we've kind of gone over, a lot of the rule following stuff is very intertwined in a lot of really important philosophical issues. So it's worth reading cover to cover. It's your shortest book, um,
Yeah, it is.
but it's very good, very dense in the right kind of way. The only thing I guess I should ask about is, do you want to say anything? You don't have to, but do you want to say anything about the paper you sent me? Sort of how your thoughts from between that the book and now changed on the phenomenology point?
Yeah, the only thing I guess I wanted to say was I took I accepted Kripke's picture of the phenomenology of rule following, that we're really, that we have a certain amount of confidence when we're engaged in arithmetic, um, uh, and we're also feel justified. That's how he kind of presents it. And there's a way in which he's running experiences we have together, because our ordinary, um, when I'm talking to you, when you're talking to me, we're not confident that we're using the words correctly. We're just using the words. There's no
Yeah.
confidence. And we don't think we're being justified or not justified. And when we're experienced about doing arithmetic, again, there's no confidence. We just do it. Issues of confidence come up and justification comes up when we're challenged. And so, what I actually
Right.
wanted to suggest is that when Kripke is describing the phenomenology of rule following, he's running together cognition and metacognition.
Yeah.
He's and I realized that, and I mea culpa, I was doing the same thing in the book when I was describing his picture. And so, what I'm doing in the paper is saying we need to correct that bit, because when we do, we realize that the notion of justification that's pertinent, this is what I claim in the article, is epistemic. It's not normative. And it's not about correctness conditions. It's simply about, it's an epistemic thing, which makes the skeptical challenger, the skeptic, more like an ordinary skeptic. So
Right.
that's the
Yeah.
paper argument.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's forthcoming in wherever it's forthcoming. In Milan, I think, a journal, a special issue on Kripkenstein that's coming out in a few months.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So good to know you haven't stopped thinking about this stuff. Maybe we'll see some more. I'm sure there's always stuff to untangle. Um,
Yes, I'm afraid there is. That's the other thing. You're never right. You're just, closer, closer to
yeah.
right
Maybe slightly
over
less
time.
wrong than you were before at best, you know?
Maybe hopefully it's a success curve moving in
Right.
the right direction.
Right, right. Okay, yeah, well, go ahead and wrap up the recording here then if you don't have anything else. I will link, of course, your website in the description. So anybody go, of course, look at Dr. Azzouni's books, buy them, read the papers and all that kind of thing. And your poetry as well, which I've not read yet, but I'm sure is great.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and well,
There's a
thank
vote of
you.
confidence.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, thank you.
thank you very much for joining me. This was a lot of fun, and I kept you for a while, but this was really cool. So thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.